In 1979, an economic crisis in Iran led to massive protests and thousands of people were killed. Today, an economic crisis in Iran led to massive protests and thousands of people were killed. In 1979, the government was overthrown in a revolution. Today, there hasn't been a regime change. The headlines say this is the biggest challenge to Iran's leadership since the revolution in 1979, when the monarchy was toppled and the Islamic Republic was born. So in this FourSight, we're going to look at the similarities between then and today, and just how the Islamic Republic has managed to hold on to power until now.
Let's say that they've managed to contain the current protests. It still doesn't mean that they've solved any of the problems that are facing them.
With the economy in freefall and the regime continuing to choose repression over reform, is this the beginning of the end of Iran's Islamic Republic?
The walls are definitely closing in.
Let's start by looking at the parallels between today and what happened 47 years ago. The 1979 revolution was one of the most consequential moments of the 20th century. It saw Iran's king, the Shah, kicked out and replaced by a fundamentalist Muslim leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. In a matter of months, Iran, a country that had been a monarchy for 2,000 years, became a religious, anti-Western regime. And one of the key factors for that uprising was the economy.
The largest oil refinery in the world.
In the early 1970s, Iran was developing and it was modernizing, and that was driven by a booming oil industry. And oil production peaked in 1974. But by 1979, it had fallen by a half. And that massive decline in oil revenue meant that national income plummeted while inflation and unemployment rocketed. Iranians resented that the ruling elite and a westernized middle class were the ones benefiting most from the oil boom. And they saw that the country was plagued by overspending, corruption, waste. There were a series of mass walkouts by workers across Iran, and by November 1978, practically the whole country was on strike. That movement was started by Tehran's influential merchants in the Grand Bazaar, which is how the latest wave of protests also began. In December 2025, shopkeepers closed their businesses and they hit the streets complaining about today's bleak economic picture. Because Iran's economy is in a mess right now. Year-on-year inflation is running at more than 50%, while the currency has crashed in value. There's mass unemployment and one major bank has collapsed, with 5 others thought to be at risk. And on top of all that, years of mismanagement and corruption have left the country facing severe water shortages, so bad that in late 2025 the president warned Iranians that Tehran, the capital and home to almost 10 million people, was on the brink.
I think the problem now is that the crisis you're facing at the moment is symptomatic of this deeper sort of environmental and economic mismanagement and malaise that's affecting the country.
To help me understand how today compares to 1979, I spoke to Ali Ansari. He's a professor of Iranian history and an author of several books on the country. And he says that today is far worse than 1979.
The situation of Iranians at that time was, in financial terms and in personal terms, considerably better than you find today. Now you find a situation where the economic situation is so bad that almost people are rebelling out of desperation.
Let me give you an example of how much worse the economy is today. Throughout 1979, a US dollar was worth about 70 to 75 rial. That is the currency of Iran. But today, because of the state of the economy and the impact of severe international sanctions, a US dollar now gets you 1.4 million rials, which means 1 rial is worth 20,000 times less today.
The reason why a lot of them protested now is because they said they can't make ends meet.
So just like in 1979, anger and anxiety over the economy has led to protest, but also violence against those uprisings by a regime that's trying to hold on to power. During the reign of the Shah, thousands of Iranians were imprisoned and tortured by Savak. That was the monarchy's secret police force. The Islamic Republic's official textbooks say that 15,000 people were killed and wounded during the revolution. Independent studies say that between 1963 and 1979, the number killed by the Shah was closer to 3,000. But let's compare that to today. There's a report put together by doctors in Iran that claims the conservative minimum number of deaths in these uprisings is between 16,500 and 18,000, with a further 300,000 people injured, all within a matter of weeks, not years. is the repression today also much worse?
Yeah, it's on a massively different scale. It far surpasses anything that happened under the monarchy.
The Iranian regime has admitted that thousands were killed during the recent protests, which they described as riots backed by Iran's enemies. So if we're making a comparison with 1979, and we're seeing an economy in an even worse situation, mass protests on a similar scale, with an even deadlier response, there's an obvious question. Why hasn't this regime fallen? That's what I asked Mariam Alamzadeh. She's writing a book about the Iranian regime.
What enables it is the multi-layered repressive apparatus that the Islamic Republic has built over the years. Such a thing did not exist under the Shah.
Understanding how the Islamic Republic is run today helps explain how it's held onto power for 5 decades. Iran has elections where voters choose a president, parliament, and an assembly of experts, which sounds like a democracy, but this is an Islamic theocracy, which means a religious authority is ultimately in charge. And at the very top is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who can basically veto any law or political appointment he doesn't like. He is where power ultimately lies.
The final word will be his. It doesn't matter if we're under threat or we're not. There's no going against him.
The supreme leader also handpicks the leaders of Iran's media and military and controls their budgets. But arguably, the most effective tool he has for keeping power is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, aka the IRGC.
Over the past almost 5 decades, the IRGC has become the most important element to the regime.
The Revolutionary Guard isn't part of Iran's military. While the army exists to protect Iran's borders, the IRGC is an ideological militia with a mission written into the constitution of guarding the revolution and its achievements. It has its own navy, air force, and 180,000 full-time soldiers. It has an overseas special force known as the Quds Militia, and hundreds of thousands of volunteers across Iran known as the Basij Militia, waiting in the wings for when more boots on the ground are needed back home. So added together, you have close to 1 million people ready to act under the IRGC's banner.
They are crucial in ensuring that the supreme leader's power remains intact.
And despite demonstrations and political unrest over the past 5 decades, including the unprecedented movement that we've seen recently, no senior commander in the IRGC has ever publicly criticised the Ayatollah. So how does the supreme leader command that sort of loyalty?
The financial benefits that come with being associated with the IRGC are good incentives for many of them to stay.
Do you think it's less ideological, is what you're saying now, and they're more interested in the financial benefits that they get?
Absolutely, I have no doubt.
The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s was pivotal to cementing the IRGC as a power in Iran. That conflict saw it morph from a fighting force into an economic and political powerhouse, because during the conflict it became the main contractor for development projects across Iran. Since the end of the war in 1988, the IRGC's interests in Iran have expanded into almost every part of Iran's economy. And while more than a third of Iranians, that's around 30 million people, live in poverty, the system's been designed to keep members of Iran's ruling elite, including members of the IRGC, wealthy and powerful in return for their loyalty to the supreme leader.
It's not just a good salary, it's the sort of advantages that come with the job. It's the chance to get rents and get massive loans from banks.
So that's how the regime can rely on a specific military group to crush opposition. But it also shows why economics is still so important to the future of the Islamic Republic.
With the rate that the economy is collapsing, I think it can't protect and keep loyal the institutions that have been doing their bidding.
So the internal threat is clear. But another reason the Islamic Republic has lasted so long is its ability to stop external threats too. Since the 1980s, Iran's IRGC has built a network of armed proxies, known as the Axis of Resistance. So Tehran supported the formation of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Badr Corps in Iraq. They also fund the Houthis in Yemen and propped up the Assad regime in Syria with military and financial support. But after October the 7th, the regional picture changed dramatically. Assad has fled Syria, Hamas has been decimated in Gaza, and Hezbollah is a shadow of itself after targeted Israeli attacks on the group in Lebanon. And crucially, Iran's own military strength was undermined in the 12-day war with Israel last year. Israel killed some of its key military leaders and destroyed the country's most advanced air defences, which were followed by precision strikes on Iran's nuclear weapons program by the US.
What it did suffer was the realization that it had been badly infiltrated by Israeli operatives.
That's Roxanne Farman-Fahmian, a lecturer in international relations at the University of Cambridge with a focus on Iran.
The other thing that happened was that over 1,000 everyday Iranians were killed, and this was a shock.
Military embarrassment and an economic crisis fueled by strict international sanctions has left Iran looking vulnerable to outsiders, with Donald Trump openly supporting the uprising and suggesting the United States might even get involved.
We're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it.
But would Iranians even want foreign intervention if it were on offer?
Many Iranians do not want to see their country fall into chaos, and their worry is that any outside interference would do that.
Their skepticism about outside intervention comes from the West's track record during the 20th century.
British prospectors found oil in commercial quantities.
The British discovered oil in Iran back in 1908, and they created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, that's now known as BP, to ensure access to Iran's resources for decades. And it was the British who helped the last Iranian dynasty, the Pahlavis, gain power in the 1920s, while the United States was also a backer of the Shah.
The Iranians themselves never actually chose the Pahlavis. The Pahlavi monarchy was placed on the throne by first the British and then the Americans.
An attack on Mossadegh's home was later followed by his arrest.
To protect their economic and political interests, the CIA, along with help from British intelligence, conducted a coup in 1953 that overthrew a reformist prime minister who had nationalised Iran's oil industry. But now there does seem to be this shift in opinion. People in Iran hoping for a US president to come to their rescue would have been unthinkable even a few years ago. But some protesters wanted just that after Trump had made threats against the regime.
I talk to young people and they go, yeah, it's all a bit ancient history to us. Who cares? And part of their view is of course, that the Islamic Republic has done far worse things to us than the British or the Americans ever did.
And if history is being turned on its head and we're comparing today to 1979, some Iranians seem to want a complete reverse. Maybe that's why they've been chanting things like this. They're calling out for Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of the last Shah who currently lives in the United States. He's encouraged the recent protests and at a press conference in Washington said that the regime was close to collapse.
I will return to Iran. I am uniquely positioned to ensure a stable transition.
But while he's been building some support in the international community, it's less clear he has the backing needed to take power in Iran itself or simply be a transitional figure.
To yell his name is perhaps the greatest insult to the Islamic Republic that protesters could use. Another element is that there's always a sense of nostalgia. Many of the people in the streets feel as though it was somehow had to have been better than what they have today.
After the revolution in 1979, the regime cemented itself deeply into every part of Iranian life. It built a powerful security and intelligence apparatus to brutally crack down on dissent at home and fight foreign influence abroad, and kept Iran's elites rich and powerful enough to secure their loyalty to their regime. So let's go back to the original question. Is this the beginning of the end? Well, it doesn't look like Iran is on the brink of a second revolution right now, but it's clear that the regime is facing a unique challenge. This uprising is just the latest in a series of massive protests by Iranians desperate for reform or revolution. In 2009, there were huge demonstrations to oppose a rigged election. In 2017 and 2019, there were protests over the economy and rising fuel prices. And then in 2022, thousands took to the streets after a young woman, Mahsa Amini, was arrested for not adhering to Iran's strict Islamic dress code and who later died in prison. Before, the regime has managed to find a way to answer its critics and stop the protests. But today, there's no obvious or easy solutions to the economic catastrophe that sparked this wave of unrest. And a violent response can only go so far.
People have been astonished at the level of violence inflicted against them. And, the anger is now palpable in Iranian society. There's a sort of a mutual hatred, a mutual loathing, and let's be honest, the mutual fear.
So not everyone agrees on what exactly will happen next to the Islamic Republic, but this is the biggest test of the regime's absolute power for nearly 50 years.
For over a century, they have been very badly governed. They deserve better. And I think they feel that with the Pahlavis, and I think they feel that with the Islamic Republic.
To talk more about the challenges Iran is facing and what their future might hold, I'm joined now by the journalist, writer and academic Azadeh Moaveni. So Azadeh, given the situation that we've just laid out in our video, do you think there's any support left for the regime in Iran?
The regime has had a core base of supporters that have pretty much been unchanged in sort of proportion to the general population for maybe the last 25 years. And that is something between 15 to 20% of Iranians who reliably vote for hardline candidates in elections. And these are people who are beneficiaries of the system, who benefit from its state capture, its corrupt networks, or are ideologically die-hard. So they remain. The regime turns them out as a show of support, but they're holding essentially the rest of the population of a country of 90 million sort of captive to the interests of this minority. And it's worth pointing out that the traditional base of the regime, which is the working poor, this was an Islamic revolution predicated on the idea of social justice, is no longer backing it. That base is now the opposition. So the core that you have supporting the system is crony networks, beneficiaries, employees, and the ideologically still committed.
Is there any chance that there might be reform at all, concessions, given the economic crisis they're in?
It is the question of the hour, but all indications are that the system is completely frozen. It's paralyzed in place. I mean, it finds itself needing to make sweeping, consequential decisions about its core policies, reversing them in order to meet the needs of its starving population at the brink of economic collapse. But up until now, facing all of these multiple crises, it has chosen not to change any course. I think it was very revelatory after the 12-day Israeli war last summer. One of the main policy decisions it made was to start importing very high-octane petrol, essentially only needed for luxury cars who are driven by the oligarchic elite. That was its degree of denial and refusal to shift course.
So what do you think it would take for there to be that regime change? Would it take more protests? Would it be a coup within the IRGC? Or would it just be the death of the supreme leader who is now, incredibly old and has been in power for almost 40 years?
I mean, all of these things are to an extent potentially interconnected. Any of those events, the death of the supreme leader, an IRGC coup could be a precipitating event. But what looks sort of more likely is the possibility of the threat of foreign intervention, military strikes by Donald Trump, increased economic pressure, which is possible, and it is that pressure that has bankrupted the regime, put it in a situation where it's totally out of money. I mean, that could be something that triggers economic collapse that then, puts into motion other events that lead to some sort of massive destabilization. So, which will push first, I think, it's so hard to see.
And I guess it's kind of like a quirk of history, but also a damning indictment on the Republic that if they came into being partly because Iranians did not like the Shah and they did not like Western intervention, that now here we are, 47 years later, that actually they want the Shah as a transition and also some Western intervention.
I mean, the Islamic Republic is over. It has ended as a system. Whether this regime collapses, I think, is as we just discussed, we don't know how that will happen. But this system has failed, and it has failed tragically and catastrophically. I mean, it has impoverished and underdeveloped, a country that under the Shah at the end of the 70s was in a position to be almost a first world nation in terms of where its development was going. So it is the most failed system of governance that Iranians have had perhaps since the 16th century.
I guess it's also difficult to tell what might follow because, when regimes have fallen in the Middle East, many times in recent years, there's been, civil war, there's been chaos. Is that the concern as well?
Iranians are terribly and historically, culturally, sort of seized by a fear of the fragmentation of their country. And I think that is a real fear. If there was some sort of military intervention that looked as though it was heading towards the intentional sort of collapse of central government authority and the balkanization of Iran into a sort of rump state, sort of as what we saw with Iraq following the 2003 invasion. I mean, I think people would recoil at that. At the same time, I think people very much, many people feel that without any kind of foreign intervention, there is no way out of this impasse. You know, what comes next? The notion that some sort of reshuffling at the top, the removal of the supreme leader could then bring about a slightly more pragmatic, general leader, perhaps, who would concede on the West security concerns. I mean, for Iranians, that's very distressing, because what they want most of all is transparency. They want rule of law, and the country's underdevelopment and its terrible kind of state that it's in right now, running out of water, running out of electricity, complete state capture. None of that would be addressed by just a shifting of, the autocrat at the top.
You were talking there about what the Iranian people want. I mean, there's been these big moments in the last more than 100 years, the constitutional revolution of the early 20th century, the coup in 1953, then the revolution itself in 1979. Do you think the Iranian people will ever properly get a chance to choose how they're governed?
And I think Iranians have been close. I mean, moving towards a system in which there was a minimum of rule of law, where people did not feel that their lives were, their economic lives, that their daily lives were subject to corruption and bribery and the whim of an unelected leader at the top, where the press was more free. I mean, we have had moments of that in the past. In the 50s, even in the era of the Shah, there was, to an extent, rule of law. There was some space for transparency, not full, not as much as Iranians wanted. But I think where we are now is so dark. It is so bleak and so far away from any previous moment where Iranians have agitated for these things, for proper governance, for transparency, that moving towards them simply would be an improvement.
Azadeh Moavani, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for making it to the end of another FourSight. And thank you in particular to the contributors who are so invaluable in helping me understand this incredibly important and potentially pivotal moment for Iran. Please do write in the comments, because I do read them. Last time you gave me some feedback about our history on Iran and Israel, and I read those and I took those on board when we made this episode. If you did like this video, please like, please subscribe, and I'll be back in a few weeks for the next episode of FourSight. And if you've got any ideas about what I should be talking about next, please write in the comments.